welcome everybody. Glad to have you here with us for our set of questions and answers. As you can tell, we're taking your questions in our Q&A feature here in Zoom. If you haven't had a chance to review the questions that others have asked, feel free to take a look. And if there are questions that you are particularly interested in seeing the answer to, go ahead and vote it up by giving it a thumbs up. And we'll try to address those questions sooner as a result of that feedback. So that will determine what we address first. And if we run out of time, we'll try to make sure we address anything that has that notation. But I will start with a couple of the questions that came in before the session itself started, since those folks have been waiting a bit. So let's see. A question that came in from Chad. Well, actually, here, before we do that, I guess I should introduce the team. So today there are 4 of us working with you on your questions. Forrest is actually hiding in the audience with you guys. He's submitting the questions that came in ahead of time and likely will speak up as needed. Pam and I are here talking live and we'll be addressing the bulk of the questions. JP's with us as well, addressing questions that have straightforward text answers or URLs or things like that. So hopefully we'll be able to address everything amongst us. So that's what we've got in terms of the team. And just so we have something pretty to look at when we're not looking at demos, there's a picture we can all look at. Okay. So the question from Chad, what is the best method for handling arguments that are used by job options where the arguments change infrequently, but the job runs on a regular schedule? Should key storage be used? Should there be an arguments intake job to persist those arguments in a file or database where the consuming jobs reference them? Looks like Chad is here with us, so we may ask some clarifying questions, but Pam, I'm wondering if you want to talk about this generally, or if you have questions for Chad, maybe bring those questions up. This is one of the more popular questions that's come in, so seems like a good one for us to start with.
So I have some questions for you, Chad, and I don't know if we can.
Sure thing.
So for your job, is it also a job that's run by users who might select other options, or are the variables always the same when the job runs?
Yeah, that's a good point. This is going to be mostly jobs that are going to be initiated via Jenkins. And so it's going to be part of a pipeline where Jenkins will handle the builds, push artifacts to a Nexus repo, and then we'll have Rundeck handle the actual deployments. We're still working on improvements elsewhere in our development and build pipelines, but the desire from the client is that we'll have, for example, say an ETL job that runs every day, but it's only going to, we're not going to change the artifacts that it's building and deploying every day as well. So the idea would be like, I push version 1 this week, but until version 2 is pushed, I want those arguments for that job to persist. But we're trying to configure these jobs to where they can be reusable. So that way we can have encapsulation between multiple ETLs, but use the same job definition without having those arguments inherently tied to the job. My current solution is what I kind of asked was that I have another job where I actually write the arguments to a file and then I have another job step where it can parse that file and consume those arguments. But
yeah, that's probably the way that I would approach it too. So another way that you could do it is if the file was at a URL, right? So if the data changed, you don't have to run that other job, right? So if you get the file from a URL, which you probably could have a URL in Jenkins where you could get it, right? So you get it on the fly each time the job runs.
Okay, yeah, so then that's kind of where we'd also look at using, is that similar to using Jenkins as an option provider, or is this a little different than that?
Well, if it's a file of variables, there's actually a node step to run a script or file from a URL.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, so you could just get it from the URL, or you could even use the HTTP node step to get it from a URL. And if you use if it was like a JSON file that you got from the HTTP step and you did like a print to screen, if you're in Enterprise, you can use the log filters with the JQ log filter to actually make the key value pairs dynamically as the data dot variables.
Gotcha. I have one more question. I don't mean to dominate everybody's time, but up here on my project also had the idea of using the CLI to just modify default arguments of the job definition by using the CLI to communicate through the REST API and actually just change them there. And I'm a little wary of that approach because that just feels dangerous.
You could do that, or I believe you could use a webhook from Jenkins, right? So the payload of the webhook would be your job options, right? And then I would do it as job options when using a webhook.
Okay. Is there any danger in having like a build step in Jenkins that would modify a job definition to change arguments?
I don't think I would modify the job. I would use a webhook or the CLI, right? Because then you can input it as options. So the webhook, I think, is the easier way to do it. And you can even, if you use rule sets and things like that, if you're using the webhook, you could change how the job runs, right? Depending on what the options are. And you could then change which job would run. So in Enterprise, we allow you to, you could have one webhook that would run a job based on parsing out of the payload that came in with the webhook.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for those questions, Chad. And I think just to come back to that, I think for anyone who's looking at something similar, the best practice is going to be to not have your other systems modifying jobs on the fly, but instead passing options or updating something that the job would consume. It's fine to have automation that modifies your job, but you want to have there be some controls around approvals and that sort of thing. You just have to be a lot more careful when you're modifying the job as opposed to the options, that you don't have something that will give you an undesired result. So you can certainly solve it several ways, but I think either passing things to the CLI or using webhooks or an API call as methods of reaching out and calling it with the options you want is probably the safer, best practice way of handling those sorts of things. That's great stuff. All right, we've got a couple of questions that are related from David. First, the one he put in today live. What's the best way to handle automatically running scheduled jobs that should have run while Rundeck was in passive mode? And then let me read the other question that he submitted early because I think it's related. We use Rundeck to schedule many tasks. When Rundeck is put into passive mode, the jobs that should have run don't. Once Rundeck is turned back to active mode, we need to manually run those jobs that were missed. Is there a way to do that automatically? What's the best way to run any jobs that should have run during an outage? We recently purchased Rundeck Enterprise, if that makes a difference in the answer. We're in the process of porting things over. So I'll let Pam dig into this a bit as well, but let me speak to this generally. There is a scenario in here that's definitely not well addressed today, and that our dev team's been looking at how to change the behavior a little bit. So cases where a scheduled job gets missed because a server goes down should get caught, but these ones where there's a passive mode scenario may not get caught. So we're looking at how to change that behavior a little bit. Pam, do you have any ideas of a way to work around this in the meantime?
Yeah, let me share my screen. So just in case anybody who's on open source, in Enterprise, you can have multiple instances of Rundeck. And I'm actually on the cluster manager page right now, which is here. Instance in Rundeck can have a mode, right? So you could be in active mode, which means it's running all jobs, or you could actually turn that off and put it what's called passive mode. And that means that that instance of Rundeck won't run any jobs. So we had a whole webinar on this, and we can provide you the link to the webinar, but we have policies that you can write that will, if a node goes down, right, it will automatically take over a schedule and that type of thing. But when an instance is in passive mode, currently Rundeck doesn't recognize that instance as being offline. So even with an auto takeover policy, it's not going to take the jobs over that were scheduled. So my suggestion would be you come into the cluster manager. Right now you can see I actually have 2 nodes in this cluster, but one of them happens to be down right now. But if the other node was up, I could come in and you can see it says which member is going to run the job. So you can filter based on the member that you're going to take down. So in this case, right, it would be, because it's the only one I have right now, but you get the idea. So I would filter on my Rundeck 1, then I could select all the jobs that were on scheduled to run on that system, and I could change the schedule owner to when that is online. And after doing that, I would put the cluster member in passive mode if that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think the thing to bear in mind is passive mode, it should generally only happen because someone did something on purpose, which I think is why the code didn't really originally account for it. So the method that Pam's suggesting is probably the intended behavior, which is to say, if you know you're going to put a server in passive mode, make sure you've taken care of any scheduled jobs for it initially, move them, and then go ahead and take it into passive mode. As I said, we're looking at ways to adjust that behavior a little bit so that it might get accounted for differently, but until we can see what that change looks like, we won't really know what the new behavior will be. All right, so you're using passive mode to turn off scheduled jobs so that no jobs run on the database while the database is down for maintenance. I think the way to accomplish that for you in a better way, at least for now, would be to either turn off the schedules. So this gets a little bit complicated depending on the version of Rundeck you're using, but you're just moving to Enterprise. So as you move into Enterprise, take a look at project schedules as the way to handle this. Project schedules allow you to establish a schedule that affects multiple jobs potentially. And if you turned off that schedule, that would keep those jobs from running. So putting a server into passive does kind of accomplish what you meant to do, but to think about that, because your desire is to say, I want to effectively delay those scheduled jobs rather than miss them. And I think any of the methods we can give you currently would make them so that they get effectively missed. Let me think on that, and maybe we'll come back to it. I wonder if using a different method of setting a next run for those that would be different from the normal schedule, but address it. But I'll have to ponder that a little bit and see if we can make a different suggestion. I don't think the way you're trying to accomplish it is the right way to do it, even currently. And we'll have to see if any changes to this make that work more like what you want. But I can see how you got where you're getting. So it's a reasonable approach, but I think we should be able to give you a different approach to it. So we'll ponder that and come back to it and see if we can come up with a different way. The next question was a question from Kevin. Can you give a demo of Rundeck calling an API? Pam, do you have anything that you could show around that piece?
Yes. So first, I'm sure you're aware Rundeck has an API so that within Rundeck, you can do almost any operation that you would do in the UI through the API. And I'm gonna paste this link into chat right now. So do we have chat? Somebody paste the API link into chat for everybody for me for the documentation. I brought this job up. So I actually have a job where I want to know how many jobs are on a given Rundeck server across all projects and how many runs they've had by particular users. So when I run this job, and I've been sitting idle for a while, so this is this project count job, right? So I'm using the Rundeck API to get a count of all of my projects, all of the jobs within the projects, and the number of times jobs have been run by each person. Kind of a thing that customers ask me for a lot, right? So it tells me my total number of projects on the server, right? And then it goes through and counts the total number of jobs and executions per user. So to get this, I use the API. And if we look at the workflow, it's going to show you, right? So this is, so I'm not showing you from the command line, but a bash script is basically the same. So this one is using curl, and I'm just using get. I'm running it from the Rundeck server, so I'm just using localhost with the port, and then I'm just putting in, right, the API paths for all projects there. And you can see this command in the API reference if you want. So I need a header because I want to output into JSON, because you may have noticed I'm using the log JQ filter in order to pass some information to the next step. And then I also have to provide my auth token. So I've put my auth token within an option, and I'll show that really quick. So up here, right, I actually kind of did a little cheat. I put it in my key store so I don't have to expose it to anybody. So it's my admin token that I'm using for this job. So this option is a secure password input option, and it allows me just to select the token from the key store. So discard and pop over there for a minute, right? So to create a token, cancel. Create a token, you go into your own profile, right? Just click add the token. This is all permission based, so it depends on the permissions you have, right? And I'm just gonna make another token for the admin, generate token, then click show token and copy it. And then you would just go into the key store, and you can see I have a folder in my key store for tokens. So saved it here. So I also have within this project, I have a couple examples of, so you can see these are all my jobs that actually all these jobs use the API. So checking kind of along the lines of what is my Rundeck mode, we'll go with that one. Click, sorry, the quick issue there. Come on. It's job. Right, so I could also use a HTTP step. So typically, and you'll see here, the idea with this job is I've set up all my Rundeck nodes in the cluster as, all my Rundeck instances are set up as nodes so that I can actually run this on each of my Rundeck hosts. So I'm going in the public path this way using the node attribute. So this will run for each one of my hosts. Putting in my API path, it's a get, right? In the header, providing my token. And again, because I prefer JSON, I'm making sure that it's passing me back JSON so that I could parse it or put it in a table. And then down here, I'm printing out the response, right? And this allows me to see it in the log output. If I didn't have that, it would run the command and I wouldn't see anything in Rundeck. So hopefully that answers your question. That's 2 ways of making the API call.
Thanks, Pam. I think those were good. So depending on how we interpreted the question, it could have been a question more about calling another API, meaning not Rundeck, but I think the process is the same. You're generally passing through something like an HTTP step out to whatever the API endpoint is for whichever API you're dealing with, and chances are you have to have an API token in the same way that ours does. So hopefully that helps clarify that. Okay, another question from David. What features are available to trigger job execution based off of another job's status or state? I'm aware of wait for job execution, job state conditional, and job references. Is there a way to be conditional on a job starting execution? I don't know. Pam, do you know if there are any other conditions, and specifically whether there's a way to be conditional on a job start? I think the idea would be job B only starts after we know that job A has started. Obviously, I could do that if I'm doing a complex workflow, maybe, but otherwise, I don't know necessarily. And even then, I don't know that it would be specific to saying I want to only start after this other job started.
Yeah. So we have. Okay. So I opened a job for editing, and then I just searched for exe. So we have, right, job state conditional execution wait result, right?
So if you want to tie it to the on start, it's not really that much different than just linking to the job as a job step, right? If you're trying to start this job and start another job at another time, then it's just a step that calls the other job.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the things he's trying to accomplish is that he wants separate log files, and in that case, I would trigger the job with a webhook.
I just unmuted David so he could add some more color to this.
Good afternoon.
Hey, David.
Yeah, basically what I've been able to research so far is that the wait for job execution, for that execution is it can, when you point it to a job that is not currently running, you can let it periodically check that until it is running, and then it will check for the execution. Is there any downside of having the job running always in the background, apart from like our job timers being off?
So are you trying to do something where you're like waiting for a file to appear to kick off a job, or is that your use case?
That is my use case.
I'm going to put Forrest on the spot. I think that in the future roadmap, we actually have a feature called reactions that will do that. Forrest, can you speak to reactions at all?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I'd also seen the execution flow steps or workflow steps. And one of the questions that I had regarding that is, my understanding is that the identifier for the execution is generated once the job has begun. So I still wouldn't be able to kind of look into the future of what that job execution is going to be. Is that assumption right or wrong? Is there a way to know what the job execution URL is going to be?
No. Why do you need to know what the job execution URL is going to be?
What was mentioned in the beginning, the situation is we have a job B that is contingent upon job A finishing, and we don't know when job A is going to start or when it's going to finish. When I was looking at the execution workflow steps, I was seeing that all of the references for what that workflow step is going to be looking for were execution IDs.
I think that I would probably do something like this. So you can run a job using an HTTP step.
Okay.
So you, like if you didn't want to, like Forrest was saying, have a job reference where job A is the first job, right, that you reference, and then job B is the second job that you reference, that would definitely make it so A finishes, right, and it finishes successfully before B runs. But if you needed to have the executions IDs separate for each job, then I would use the HTTP step with a webhook in order to accomplish that.
Okay.
Right. So you would, and actually this is kind of not the, you would create your webhook for the job that you want to run, and then you could just set up your HTTP request step. So I'd probably make this a workflow step, and it's a workflow step that would come after, right at the very end of job A, and only run if all the previous steps were successful. So it's just the URL, and then if you don't have any options, if you wanted to pass information from this job, you can actually create a payload to send. But if there's nothing, you still need to put in the open close parentheses in the body, because the webhook does expect something.
Okay.
So that would trigger the next job, I think, in the way that you want. And I'll just show the webhook. So this is the webhook that I created, and it's just a very straightforward, right? There's the post URL that I'm using, and I just used a very simple one, run a job, and I chose the job I wanted to run.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, David. Okay, so there's some questions about using containers in Rundeck nodes. I'm not 100% clear, so let me talk generally about containers for everyone, and then if we get some clarification, I can try to offer some clarification. So Rundeck's instances, the members of a Rundeck cluster in enterprise or an individual server, could be a container. That is, there's nothing stopping that. Obviously, there are some considerations about how you handle configuration details and other data that you need to access, but we have methods in place to handle that. So there isn't necessarily anything special you need to do to allow using containers. You could also have containers that are the nodes under management. And again, generally speaking, there's no reason that we can't be managing nodes. I think where this question may be heading, and Forrest, I know you had some back and forth here, where it may be heading is how to add new nodes that are containers. And I guess theoretically that's possible, but I'm not sure what the method would be to have people doing that. So I don't know, Pam or Forrest, if you wanted to.
I'll chime in. So here, right here, I'm sharing my screen again still, right?
Mhm.
This local host, this is actually Docker containers that I have running. So in my, it actually doesn't matter. If I wanted to add additional nodes to a cluster, whether they're containers or not, I could actually just use the source, the node wizard. I'm gonna completely, you guys are still seeing my screen, right?
We are. I think it's toward the bottom.
Oh, you know what? Actually, I think because this is not 3.3.
We went back and forth a little bit in the Q&A chat as well. I think where the question was coming from was just in general how to add new nodes. If anyone, if you're trying to learn Rundeck, we have a whole tutorial section within our docs that does a great, step-by-step on the various components. There's some sample code, tells you how to build some environment pieces, etc. So that's a great place to kind of start and learn about how to add various things.
Thank you, Forrest. Okay, next question we had was a question that Kevin had submitted ahead of time. Does Rundeck Enterprise support SSO with Azure AD myApps? So SSO, we're using OAuth, I think. And as I understand it, I believe Azure ID is also using OAuth. So officially, I think the OAuth platforms that we have built and work with are Ping Identity and Okta. But my understanding is that Azure AD's method is comparable, so it should work. But I don't know for sure of anybody who's done it yet. So it's more of a qualified yes. But my understanding from talking to several colleagues is that that should work, and it's just a matter of getting the syntax right. So if you're an enterprise customer, then definitely reach out to our support team, and we can help figure out what you need to know to make that work. Yeah, so Kevin, your question in terms of the PagerDuty API piece, that's a good question. I don't know that we have anything that's pre-built that would show what you want. So we can follow up with you offline to address that, but we can hopefully share that to you in a future webinar as well. Obviously, we're getting to know our colleagues on the PagerDuty side the last couple of weeks, and we're having meetings with them to figure out how to broaden what we're able to show and broaden the integrations that we can explain to people, and that certainly seems like that'd be one that would fall in that bucket. Avneet had some questions about setting up Rundeck and high availability. Forrest pointed to our clustering overview documentation, and we've done webinars on this topic before. So there is no, it sounds like you're trying to set it up in open source. There's no supported method to do it in open source. I actually don't know what to suggest as far as that goes. I can give you answers in the context of the enterprise version, which has high availability and has clustering. And that's where the documentations would point to that Forrest was sending you to, as well as the webinar we've had. My guess is there may be a way to try to hack together something that accomplishes that, but honestly, that's one of the main reasons that people decide to upgrade to the enterprise version over the open source, is because they want clustering and high availability, and we have a number of options that can be configured to tailor to your needs in enterprise in terms of how to handle different scenarios for high availability. So I'd recommend taking a look at the documentation, maybe reviewing the webinar as well, and if need be, we can talk to you directly about how some of that works if you have some additional questions. Okay, Mark, I was wondering if there are any updates on being able to prompt a human to continue the execution of a job. At one point, it seemed like it was on the roadmap. The use case here is reviewing a Terraform plan before applying it. So Forrest kind of addressed this. It is something that's on the long-term roadmap. If other needs here or use cases, it would be good to let us know what you have in mind so we can try to address those in what will be coming down the road. We're certainly, trying to find a way to adapt this into Rundeck without breaking the other things that Rundeck does, and that's part of the trick. So, Mark, I think we've got the appropriate answers, but I'd encourage others, if you have thoughts on this, if this is something you need, to let us know what specifically you're looking to do, so we can try to address your use cases as well. I'm not sure about either of the remaining questions. So one seems to be grabbing the latest build. We don't use a latest tag, so you want to make sure that you get the snapshot version. If you're going through Docker, there are tags there that you can see through Docker Hub.
So
But I guess
my warning on the snapshot version is that is like a bleeding edge and sometimes untested set of code. I would actually recommend focusing on and looking at hub.docker.com and seeing what version you're comfortable running. And you can add that version to the end of the Docker image.
good advice. Thank you, Forrest.
So there was one ACL question around, it was also related to an LDAP Active Directory authentication situation. As we went through the chat, I think with Avni, he's getting one error that we're aware of that there's a cosmetic bug. It's not functionally, having an impact on the ACLs, but there is a bug related to LDAP and ACLs where you're going to get a screen that says you have no authorized access to projects when you may actually have authorized access. So that will be fixed in 3.3.5. Beyond that, it seems like we'd have to get kind of deeper into the details of what the trouble is, and it was directed to the community channel. So maybe we'll just kind of spin this into the various community channels that we have available that you can also participate in or banter with other community members on.
Right. So if you're using the open source version, you could definitely address questions to the community. I think in terms of the ACL piece, the functions of the ACL are essentially the same between Enterprise and the open source version. The general question that I saw before we started today was, how do I provide access to someone to only a specific project or a set of projects rather than everything? And you definitely can do that in ACLs. It sounds like there may be a bug that's going to get addressed here shortly around certain scenarios where it will appear you're not getting access even though you do have it. But you can definitely call out specific access to projects based on the role. So whether you're doing this through Active Directory, LDAP, some sort of SSO provider, when a user gets logged in, we find out what roles or groups they belong to, and then you have an ACL, an access control set up for those groups or roles, and that establishes what they're able to see. So if you configure them to have access to project A but not project B, they should be in a scenario where they will see project A and be able to drill into it and not see project B. So the way it's intended to work is that they wouldn't even have visibility for projects they don't have access to. But that's established at the time they log in based on the groups that they belong to and the associated roles or permissions for those. So generally speaking, that's the approach to it. Anybody else have questions around ACLs or anything else? We've got a few minutes left in our time, and I'm happy to try to address other questions or dig into this topic further if that's useful. So feel free to throw more into the Q&A area or potentially speak up as well.
It looks like we have David just raised his hand.
Avneet also asked whether we could unmute them so that they could speak up as well.
Hello, this is David O'Neill, the other here. I was asking about the scheduling. I done some follow-up with the situation I'm describing to Forrest. I just want to make sure that, you had mentioned earlier that you were going to look into that. What would be the way that I could follow up with you guys about that after you've had a chance to look into that a little more and see if there's a better way for us to be doing what we're trying to do?
Yeah, David, if you wanna just reach out to me directly in email, nathan@rundeck.com. I can circle other folks in, and we can either correspond an email to follow up or set up a call to discuss.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hey, this is Avneet. I would like to say that thanks for this effort. I mean, this is really great. It feels very good when we can reach directly to you. Even we are using open source right now, but we are actually thinking to go to enterprise as soon as we have enough jobs We are using it as a scheduling tool for all of our jobs in enterprise version. We are slowly onboarding jobs, but we have some issues that need to be looked before. As you have said with HA, once we go to enterprise, this issue will get resolved. It's good to know that. But this ACL thing is coming right in front of me. There's a big team that want to use Rundeck. I have created an LDAP group for them. LDAP group is just to authenticate them. And for authorizing, I'm using ACL. So there's a Rundeck administrator group that's pointing to ACL that has access to all the projects. It's working fine. So the similar way, I created another LDAP group and ACL for it, which is pointing to one project only. So I expected it to work the same way, but it is not working the way that we thought the administrator group should work.
Mm-hmm.
My ACL is working when I point it to administrator group. So I can see only one project when I log in using that LDAP group in pointing to one project. But when I have two groups, it's not working. Is it something you think a cosmetic thing or?
No, I think it's probably a syntax thing. It definitely, the syntax for ACLs is intended to be fairly complex to address a number of different scenarios, but that means it's easy initially to get something wrong. So I'm going to suggest if you can email me with what your syntax is, what the ACL policy looks like, I can look at that with you in email and see if we can sort it out. Just Nathan at rundeck.com, and Pam's showing us an example here as well.
Syntax for multiple groups in a policy is to use brackets, or right, is like this. So it's going to be comma separated. You don't want any spaces.
Oh, I have a project context as well, which is pointing to one project.
Yeah, so for this one, right, I'm allowing these two groups to see all the projects, but if I wanted to change this, right, I could say, is it equal or equals with a S?
I believe it's equals with an S.
Okay, and then I would put the project name in.
But your complication, Avneet, is that you're trying to do the same for more than one, and once you add more than one, then you're not getting the behavior you expect. Is that right?
Actually, I wanted to have one project for each team. I wish there's some way we can authorize these teams from LDAP, but I think there is no way to do that, right? So I'm using ACL policies to authorize them and LDAP to authenticate them.
Well, they're being authorized from the LDAP information, meaning the groups that come from LDAP are what will get used, but there still needs to be an ACL rule to indicate what privilege you want to allow or deny them. So there do need to be ACL rules to go with it, yes.
Right. So that's what the ACL group, when I am using it with Rundeck administrator group, it's working fine. I can see one project. But when Rundeck is pointing to all through another ACL and another group is pointing to one project only, then it's not working. I don't know if it's cosmetic, but even if it's cosmetic, when I hit the URL with a job, it's not allowing me. So if it's cosmetic, I think hitting the direct URL to a job should work, right? So I don't cosmetic.
Yeah, no, I think it's something in the syntax, and rather than us trying to debug it here, I think if you can follow up with me in email, I can test the same scenario, make sure I've got syntax that works for me that would do the same as yours, and then let you take that back and see if it works for you. But I'd like to start with you sending me what you're using currently, and then I will try to test that in my environment as well. Most of these cases, it gets complicated, as I said, but in most cases, once you look at it, it turns out to be something simple. It might be an extra comma or, something like that. So I don't think it'll be hard once we take a look at it, but it's usually easier to test it out to see what the problem is.
Yep, and the project names are case sensitive, right?
Right.
It has to be exactly the name if you're using equals.
That is okay. I'm using the same name. I think that won't be sure. Thanks for telling me.